welcome to the podcast Sophie au Pays des Possibles, the first podcast in French about the women and men that tackle corruption and tax evasion. I'm Sophie Lemaitre, and today is a special episode that was recorded in English. My guest is Nils Köbis, researcher and professor for the human understanding of algorithms and machines at a newly founded research center in the west of Germany. The topic of today's episode is the link or the relationship between corruption and AI. This episode with Nils is insightful. Nils tells us how AI can be a powerful tool to tackle corruption, but also how, at the same time, it can be misused to strengthen corrupt practices. Hi, Nils Köbis. Thank you for being with us today to discuss the nexus between corruption and artificial intelligence, or AI. Before we delve into the issue, can you introduce yourself?
Sure, yeah. Hi, Sophie. Happy to be here. My name is Nils Köbis. I am a researcher that currently works as a professor for the human understanding of algorithms and machines at a newly founded research center in the west of Germany. So it's a research center between basically a combination of three universities, the University of Duisburg-Essen, the University of Dortmund, and the University of Bochum. And I think these three universities basically try to shift the paradigm in academia a little bit and by collaborating and not competing with one another. And they do that with topics that require such a collaboration, and one of them being AI. So my research there deals with the impact that AI has on our behavior, specifically our ethical behavior, and how sometimes we might be using algorithms to break ethical rules, and how sometimes AI might be used to even engage in corruption. But on the other hand, also how you might be using AI as a tool to fight corruption. Those are some of the topics that I do my research on. And most of my research is basically inspired by behavioral science, social psychology, behavioral economics. Generally, really try to adopt an interdisciplinary perspective.
And so what led you to work on both corruption and AI? Was there like one day you woke up and you were like, okay, I have to work on it? Or something in your research, you discovered the role of corruption and its link with AI?
Yeah, so I did my PhD back in Amsterdam with a thesis titled The Social Psychology of Corruption. So for 4 years, I was in a very fortunate position that my supervisors basically allowed me to roam around and read a bunch of, papers, books from other disciplines on corruption, because at that time, there wasn't really a lot of research in psychology that had an explicit focus on corruption. So for these, 4 years, I was really exploring different disciplinary perspectives on corruption, and led to the foundation of the Interdisciplinary Corruption Research Network. And I got to speak to a lot of really interesting colleagues from different disciplines, and it made me realize corruption is one of those topics that is best studied from a multidisciplinary perspective. And so while I was doing that research on corruption, I basically stumbled upon a book that really sort of brought the second interest into my life. That book is called Life 3.0 by Max Tegmark. And it was gifted to me by a friend for my dissertation defense. In the Netherlands, the dissertation defense is a huge theatrical event. And as a gift, I got this book. And this book really opened my eyes to the topic of AI. This was back in 2017. And so I was starting to get increasingly interested in this topic. And then through a bunch of conversations, in particular with Christopher Starke, who at that time was living really close by, and we went running together a lot. So we discussed sort of the nexus of AI and anti-corruption. And so we basically, brainstormed, and it took really a lot of time until we really found a sort of angle. At one point, then we started thinking about maybe writing some pieces on this. And that has basically led to a few papers on this. And then I feel like the whole ChatGPT wave came. And by that time, we were already doing research on AI. And I think that has basically opened a whole new pathway for new research on AI, because all of a sudden it became much more easy to actually engage in research that uses AI tools and not just talk about it in hypothetical ways. So those events basically led me to do the research I'm doing right now.
That's interesting. So it shows the power of running or doing sport and brainstorming. Here with the podcast, a lot of our listeners now they are familiar with the term of corruption, but I don't think they will be with AI. How would you define AI and how is it different from concepts that we sometimes hear like digital tools and new technologies, blockchain, etc.? For someone that doesn't know anything but just hear AI, how would you define it?
Yeah, that's a very good question, Sophie. And it's interesting if you actually go back to the history of that term. So, the term artificial intelligence comes from the meeting of the Dartmouth College in the 1950s, where basically some researchers coined that term. And looking at the history, it's really interesting how this term has experienced hype cycles, but also AI winters, meaning that at times people had much less hope in the promises that this technology would hold. There's one definition that I find kind of interesting. It basically says AI is always the abilities of technologies that we currently think it cannot do. Right? So something like playing chess was considered AI until we solved it, or until technologies have been developed that could actually play chess, and then it wasn't considered to be AI anymore. So it's a very much a moving target, and therefore the definitions really differ. What I think is really useful to do instead of having one definition that is sort of waterproof is to think about what are the characteristics of AI that are different from what you have already alluded to, like digital technologies, etc. I think one of the key characteristics of AI is the increasing autonomy with which these systems operate. So I think that's really a paradigm shift in the sense that for the longest period, we have been using digital technologies, algorithms as tools, and we would specify exactly what they would do. AI, for example, through machine learning, but also other techniques, has basically shifted that a little bit so that the technology turns from a tool into more of an agent, right? So it becomes increasingly agentive in the sense that it does things that even the developers themselves did not predict. So to give you an example, there was this very famous game of Go that for a long time has been considered sort of unsolvable. And it was a sort of benchmark for AI researchers to say, will we ever be able to develop algorithms to play this game, which is computationally way more complex than, for example, chess, right? So the game itself has more positions than there are atoms in the universe, for example. So a brute force computational approach, like the ones that have been used to solve chess, would not work. And so a team from DeepMind developed an algorithm that would play itself to learn the rules of the game. And then this algorithm would compete with one of the grandmasters of this game called Lee Sedol. And there is a whole Wikipedia entry about one move that this algorithm AlphaGo makes. I think it's called move 37, where initially it looks like the algorithm made a mistake, right? So you have real like live commentators that are commenting on this game, which was broadcasted to millions of people. And the commentators say like, look, this was a mistake. Now the algorithm is glitching and so on. And then a few moves later, it turns out that actually the algorithm developed a whole new way to play this game. So even the developers of the algorithm had no idea about this move. And therefore, it was sort of, I would say, like a very important moment that also illustrated that point very clearly that algorithms might at times do things that we didn't expect them to do. What's really interesting as a side note is that now humans have started to adopt this way of playing. So it's not just the first really illustrative example of agentive behavior from algorithm. It is also an example of where humans have been inspired by algorithms. Maybe the only example or maybe the first one. We don't know yet because I haven't come up with many other or I haven't found many others where this type of innovation has come from algorithms towards humans.
Thank you so much, and thank you for giving us an example. I would have more questions, but the topic today is about AI and corruption. We hear that some people see AI and digital tools in general as an effective way to tackle corruption. How can AI be leveraged as a tool to combat corruption? Would you have any successful cases or examples that you could share with us so that it's more concrete?
Yeah, so I think in general, there is great hope that is placed in AI to fight corruption. Oxford Insights, a consulting agency, called it like the next frontier of anti corruption. And following this literature is really interesting because you could, sort of draw two images here. The one image is one where people might say, okay, this is just yet another hype cycle around either a technology or a tool to fight corruption, right? So if you look back, you would probably find similar articles about social media or blockchain, right? So that there was a lot of excitement and people would say, now this will actually finally help us to put a dent into corruption and to help reduce it. That's a bit more, I would say, like a pessimistic image. The more optimistic image is like maybe exactly because of these more agentive and autonomous abilities of AI, it could really be a game changer and make a real difference compared to other technologies. Now, together with Christopher Starker and Iyad Ravan, we basically thought about this quite a bit, and we kind of realized that it depends not so much on the technology itself, but really on who is using it, whether AI will have a positive effect on the reduction of corruption. And because you asked me for an example, there are already some really cool examples where civil society organizations, NGOs, journalists have been using AI to basically keep power holders accountable. One example that is often used and mentioned is the tweet Bot Rosie from Brazil that automatically analyzes the reimbursement claims of Brazilian parliamentarians, right? So you have to imagine people that are working in parliament have certain restrictions on how much money they can get reimbursed, right? So you imagine they're going out for dinner and they're submitting the receipts and get reimbursed. So far, or before Rosie, nobody actually ever really checked this, even though this data was publicly available, which is often the case with e-government initiatives, that there is data available due to, increased awareness to transparency, but that nobody really is making any use of it. And so this algorithm would analyze these reimbursement claims and would automatically tweet out a tweet to its over 40,000 followers saying, hey, parliamentarian XYZ, could you help us clarify what was going on with this reimbursement that you submitted, right? And basically the idea would be that there is a critical mass of people that would follow this tweetbot and would actually start following up and asking questions, and they could actually submit requests for clarification. And for a while, the excitement around this tool was really big because people felt like, well, this is one example how algorithmic systems can really help us in this tedious process of, for example, in this case, going through these reimbursement claims, looking for suspicious reimbursements and so on, so that it could basically kind of take a load off people and thereby help in the fight against corruption. And that general approach of bottom-up initiatives, making use of AI to fight corruption or to keep power holders accountable, is one that I still believe is potentially very powerful. At the same time, however, there are cases where you could say that AI tools have been rather abused in the fight against corruption, or with a fig leaf of fighting against corruption.
Before we go into that dark side of AI, could you give us other examples or context in which AI was used or algorithms were used to address corruption?
Yeah, so there are more tools how you can use algorithmic systems to fight corruption. Ukraine is one example where algorithms have been used in very innovative ways. So the tools Dozoro and Prozoro try to actually improve the procurement system. And also there, you use digital data that becomes openly available to detect red flags or suspicious activities and engage the public in keeping people accountable, or basically keeping them in check. There are, however, also ways how governments have been using AI tools with the goal to fight corruption, right? So there have been tools that were developed to basically predict the likelihood that someone who's applying for public office will engage in corruption. There was a project in Brazil that basically used past convictions to predict whether an applicant would be likely to be convicted of corruption. Now, this last example shows you that the use of AI to fight corruption brings with it several really big challenges. Because, for example, it's very difficult to get good training data for algorithms to predict whether someone will engage in corruption or not.
So, can you tell us more about this? The fact that it's hard to have good data to train the algorithm.
Yes.
And you were mentioning earlier, before I interrupted you to ask for more examples, you were mentioning the risk of abuse and misuse of AI. So, could you Tell us a bit more about that.
Absolutely, yeah. So on the first point, like the importance of training data, there is this adage among computer scientists, and by now I think also people outside of computer science know it, basically says garbage in, garbage out, right? So I think there's increasing awareness that if you are training an algorithm on subpar data, the output of the algorithm will at best be subpar, right? And in the case of our corruption predictions, if you have training data that is, for example, biased, you will also reproduce these biases. And just to give you an example of this case in Brazil, if you use conviction data, you can think about what are potential biases in the convictions of corruption. There might be a political bias, right? So, for example, people from one party are more likely to get convicted than others. There might be a gender bias. Maybe men are less likely to be convicted of corruption than women, or vice versa. There might be a geographical bias, that one region where actually law enforcement is relatively strong has more convictions than others. And so in a way, you can already see that these biases could enter this training data set of conviction rates. And if this training data set is then used to train an algorithm, this algorithm likely reproduces them. Now, the risk that I think comes from this use of AI against corruption is that people might overly trust such algorithms, because there is a general perception in society, especially in the wake of this recent AI hype, that these systems are super powerful, they're objective, and therefore they might sort of blindly trust whatever the algorithm says. So if, for example, someone is using such an algorithm to give you a corruption risk score of applicants, someone who is actually responsible for administering this application process might trust such a score to an extent that is not warranted. So that's one risk factor. Another risk factor comes from governments using AI in the fight against corruption as a sort of fig leaf. Now, what do I mean by that? It's basically that allegedly they're using AI tools to fight corruption, but actually they're using the infrastructure that enables them to use such tools for other purposes. And one illustrative example was the Zero Trust program in China that was used for basically scanning through even private documents of over several millions of public officials in China's data, right? So you basically create an infrastructure with the goal of fighting corruption, but obviously this infrastructure can then be abused, for example, for oppressing political opponents and so on. So these are some of the risks that can emanate from using AI to fight corruption, especially when it happens top down.
That's very interesting. It's great also that you highlight people have trust in the system and that they may not question the results they will get from the algorithm, and that we need to be careful and think about who designed, what were the bias, etc. when the algorithm was designed. Listening to you, I was wondering if there are ways to manipulate AI for corruption purposes. So here you gave us two examples, one with bias and one with abusing AI, using AI for different purpose, for example, to silence the opposition. But are there ways to manipulate AI to make it do something for corruption? I don't know if my question makes sense.
It does, Sophie, it does. I think that's a really interesting question. That's something that we actually discussed with Transparency International and ended up writing a piece with them about exactly that, the corruption risk of AI. Because from my perspective, being a psychologist, algorithms, especially the ones like recent AI algorithms that are often not 100% explainable. Some people call them black box algorithms because they're not easily explained, sort of satisfy certain criteria for being attractive tools for engaging in corruption. And I think there are two types of how the algorithms might be tools for corruption. One is, you can think of bad actors or malicious actors that have the intent to engage in corruption. And for them, AI tools might serve as a very attractive tool to basically increase the scope of their activities, but also increase anonymity, right? So algorithms often afford a type of anonymity because it's hard sometimes to know who's actually behind it. Think of, for example, attacks on social media using deepfakes to, for example, sully the reputation of politicians. if a politician is behind it, right, like a power holder is behind it and he's using such technologies, or someone is commissioning someone to use such technologies, it's often very difficult to prove that. Another important aspect of it is a sort of second leg to it, is that even well-meaning citizens, ordinary citizens, quotation mark, might be tempted to engage in, unethical behavior in the broadest sense through algorithms. Sometimes while sort of turning a blind eye, but sometimes maybe because it affords the same type of anonymity and plausible deniability to them when they're doing behavior through algorithms. So just to give you an example, if you delegate tasks to algorithms, people might get benefits from it and not really look closely as to how the algorithm achieved that goal. And an illustrative example of that is, for example, algorithmic pricing, right? So you can use algorithms to set prices in online markets. This can be on eBay or Airbnb, where you have so-called smart pricing algorithms that give you a suggestion for what price to set. But we know from research that these algorithms are often colluding with one another, right? So, for example, we know from German gas stations that the gas stations that have used algorithmic pricing were colluding with one another and therefore setting prices that were suboptimal to the consumers. And what's interesting is that you don't need to explicitly tell the algorithm to collude. It often figures this out by itself. And that algorithmic collusion is now receiving a lot of interest from economists. But from a psychologist's perspective, it's really interesting because I think for someone who wants to set a price, this might be a super attractive tool to, on one hand, get the benefit from higher prices, but on the other hand, not having to suffer the moral cost of feeling bad about collusion, because you can probably tell yourself and others that you weren't aware that the algorithm would actually collude, right? So from that perspective, I think there's a real risk how people might be either intentionally or unintentionally engaging in unethical behavior with and through algorithms.
When we think of addressing corruption, there've been research on anti-corruption messages and whether anti-corruption messages can lead to less corruption. I'm wondering, with AI, if a similar exercise has been used where AI is discouraging people to do corruption or is promoting anti-corruption, and how people react to it. Will there be more ethical behaviors, no change in behaviors? I don't know if you are aware of any research. I think you're starting to look at it, if I'm not mistaken, but looking at the interaction between the humans and AI regarding corruption.
Yeah, so not at corruption narrowly defined, but what we have done, we have used well-validated tasks in behavioral ethics to study ethical behavior. So these tasks are, for example, the die rolling game. It's a super simple game where people are privately rolling a 6-sided die, as you know from like board games. And we tell them, please report to us the number that you saw. Now, the twist in this game is that we pay them according to the number that they tell us, right? So they get €1 for reporting a 1, €2 for reporting a 2, and so on. So there is a tension between being honest and following the instructions and being dishonest and maximizing your payoffs, right? So imagine in the case you're taking the die, you're rolling a 2, and then you're thinking like, should I just report a 2 honestly, or should I go out and just say 6? Now, this game, because it is so simple, has been used extensively in behavioral science. And what's cool about it is that it actually has external validity. That means the behavior in this game actually correlates with ethical behavior outside of this controlled lab environment, right? So people are more likely to not pay for public transport if they cheat in this game. People who are cheating in this game are also more likely to deceive when they're selling goods on the market, or more likely to show up late for work. So there seems to be something about this game of tapping into a general, willingness to break ethical rules outside of these controlled lab settings. So that's kind of neat, because then you can basically study in a very controlled sense how our willingness to break ethical rules is influenced by the context in which we are. And in one study we looked at, well, what would happen if you receive advice from different agents, let's call them. So one group of agents are humans, right? So you receive an advice from another participant, and this advice can either be pro-honesty or pro-dishonesty. So pro-honesty advice would be something like, hey, Sophie, I really think you should be honest here. It's really important for society. So please report the number that you actually saw. It can also be pro-dishonesty. So another participant might tell you, Sophie, I really think you should cheat. In the end, you get the most benefit from actually reporting higher numbers and so on. So far, we basically have two groups of people, and we can see whether they're more likely to cheat when they get this advice from pro-dishonesty people. We then also generated comparable advice from language models. Back then, we started before ChatGPT, so it was a bit more difficult to actually train an algorithm to produce such text, but we managed and actually found like comparable texts. And we then gave the participants one of these four types of text. So it either came from a human or an AI, and it either encouraged them to engage in honesty or dishonesty. And what we find is that independent on who the advisor is, people are willing to follow pro-dishonesty advice, right? So if somebody tells you should really break an ethical rule here, people are taking that as a sort of leeway to break the ethical rule. And even if that advice comes from an algorithm, and even if they know that it comes from an algorithm, so we manipulated that as well. So in a way, what we found is a bit of a, you could say pessimistic insight into human decision-making, that, humans will take any bone that you will throw them to basically enable them to break ethical rules for profit. And that basically confirms a lot of research that has been done on the subject, showing that justifications for ethical behavior are really important. We often engage in unethical behavior, or we break ethical rules or bend ethical rules to an extent that we can justify to ourselves, but also to others. And it seems that AI is already powerful enough to basically pull our moral compass towards unethical behavior.
So it's sort of, if the AI is telling me I should break the rule, then I should be doing it.
Exactly. And the funny thing is that I didn't mention, Sophie, is the group of people that received the advice to be honest actually completely ignored the advice, right? So we had a really asymmetric way of following the advice. So if the advice was encouraging you to break the ethical rule, people would follow it. If it basically told you like, hey, you should forego this profit here and be honest, people would basically discard it.
That's quite depressing. How could organization and governments balance the benefits and the potential risk of corruption and the risk of abuse?
I think that when it comes to using AI as a tool to fight corruption, there are a few things that governments, but also, like bottom-up initiatives like civil society organizations, NGOs, can do to do this in a responsible way. I think one important thing is to really think about, calibration of algorithms. To what extent are you willing to falsely accuse people of corruption? And that's an important question if you consider that, an accusation of corruption often comes with a very strong stigma. So I would say it is very important to think about the right calibration of the algorithm in terms of its false positive and false negative mistakes. That means, like, are you accusing people wrongly of corruption, but also do you let actual corrupt people sort of go unnoticed by the algorithm? Now, that's a very thorny challenge to calibrate the algorithm correctly. And that goes back to the argument we said earlier, the point we made earlier about the training data. So besides having good training data, you also need to have good and well-calibrated algorithms that have been tested and validated, where you try to minimize such mistakes. I think the second thing is about how do you communicate about the algorithm. I think it's very important to give people a realistic image of its performance. So we have at our research center this concept of calibrated trust. That means we should actually try to develop systems that people develop the right degree of trust towards, right? You should not overtrust a system, meaning that you blindly follow whatever it says. And that can lead to, for example, as I mentioned earlier with the example with Brazil, people might just blindly following that the algorithm says this applicant is actually likely to engage in corruption. On the other hand, we also should avoid that people are not trusting the system enough, because there might be many situations where the algorithm is actually as good or even better than humans, right? Algorithms are, for example, they're not tired. They can do this decision on as many cases as you want to, but also they can analyze way bigger data sets and potentially in a way less biased sense than humans do. So I think it's a real interesting challenge to find the right degree of trust towards these systems. And I would say as a last thing that governments should do is actually to foster research on these systems, and research that has a really human-centric perspective, that really puts the human user of these systems into the center of the attention. Because oftentimes you can build a great system, but if you neglect the way it is actually being used by human users, you might actually lose out on the potential. And so I think having, a sort of impartial research that tests such systems, I would say, is very important. And also it's very important that you actually have research that is not necessarily being done by companies that develop such tools, because they often obviously want to convince people that these tools are performing well. So these are things that I think governments can do and can foster. And I think besides that, obviously, as a researcher, I would always say it's nice to foster research on these topics by, for example, giving out grants or enabling collaborations of researchers and other organizations to validate such tools.
Thank you. I think it gives good ideas, even for companies or other organizations, not just governments, ideas on what to keep in mind and sort of criterias or indicators when they want to use algorithm and AI. A few things around corruption and AI. Are there any other theme or topics that you think I missed and you would like to discuss today?
I think one more point maybe that I find interesting, increasingly interesting, is to think about AI in the sense that it can help us with the things that we are bad at. And I think that's how we should use it more. And the research approach that I think is really useful is not to constantly think of human versus AI, right? So for a really long time, a lot of research has always pitted humans against AI. And this, research, for example, on can a computer play chess? Can a computer play Go? Can an algorithm play whatever type of game you might think of, or use other benchmarks? Right now you have a lot of research. Can ChatGPT write text as convincingly as humans? And I've done that type of research too, so I'm not trying to point a finger. But I think it would be really useful also for the anti-corruption field to think more in terms of machine usefulness instead of machine intelligence. So that's a term that Darren Acemoglu and colleagues have introduced, to more think about usefulness of algorithmic systems rather than pure intelligence. And I think that can really also be an inspiration for the field of anti-corruption, to really think about ways how we can use these algorithms in useful ways to enhance our efforts to fight corruption, and not so much thinking about will AI replace humans in these different settings of fighting corruption. So having a more collaborative AI approach to fighting corruption, I think, could be really useful. And then I have some hope in actually these tools, bringing about at least a little bit improvements when it comes to corruption.
Thank you so much. I think it's a nice way to end with a note of hope. Thank you so much for the conversation. It was really interesting and insightful. I've learned quite a lot. It was really great to have you today.
Thanks, Sophie.
Thank you for listening to this episode. Share it with your network, friends, family, colleagues to help spread the word. If you enjoyed it, you can listen to my other episode recorded in English about the Corruption Hunter Network. It's episode 19. It's about the anti-corruption prosecutors and judges from around the world and the fantastic job they're doing to combat corruption. If you understand or speak French, check out the other episodes of Sophie au Pays des Possibles. You will hear amazing stories from NGOs, activists, whistleblowers, researchers from around the world. Thanks again for listening to this episode.